Hello, I'm part of the team that's helping provide the Outdoor Economic Impact Toolkit, which is part of the Building Outdoor Communities program. My name is Ash Morgan. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics at Appalachian State University, also the director in the Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis, also at Appalachian State University. And the purpose of this video is to provide an overview of economic impact studies. Something that you may have looked at yourself, may have read the output from some studies, or may perhaps even conducted one. Also, as part of your materials, provided as a chapter that I wrote some time ago with a colleague looking at measuring economic impacts, specifically for event tourism. So it's relevant to this program. And the point of the paper was to help policymakers and local planners understand economic impact studies with respect to event tourism, how they're conducted, the methodologies, and really overall how to provide a defensible study. So this video provides a lot of the insight that that particular chapter discusses. So what are economic impact studies? They're a very popular type of economic analysis used by the government, could be the federal level, regional level, local level, public and private institutions, event organizers, really anyone who's interested in understanding and quantifying the economic contribution of the business, a festival, event, a resource on the regional economy. The reason they're so popular is because the output metrics that are provided within the analysis are readily understandable to the general public. Therefore, they can be used as an aid to help decision making and policy. They can also examine both current impacts based on existing conditions, but also expected future impacts based on some expected change in the status quo. It's also important to mention what economic impact studies do not measure. As they trace the spending levels through an economy, they're picking up the effect of spending on the local economy, but not picking up any social effects or cultural or environmental effects. So, for example, the health implications of your recreational infrastructure as part of your community wouldn't be picked up. So, the health benefits from the recreational infrastructure wouldn't be captured. But what would be captured would be the dollars and cents associated with your recreational infrastructure. There are essentially four steps in the analysis. Step one is to gather the data, and that's something that will be discussed and materials will be provided for later as part of this program. Step two would be to enter the data and run the analysis. Step three would therefore be to interpret the data, and step four would be to write the report and provide your results. So an economic impact study is really picking up three types of effects that are associated with your resource or the event. They are direct effects, indirect effects, and induced effects. The direct effect, these are the initial effects associated with the presence of the resource, the recreational infrastructure, as that brings in visitors to your community. They're bringing in with them money that they're spending locally, and any local spending is captured as a direct effect. And so it's the value of industry production that's applied to these multipliers that we'll talk about that help quantify the subsequent secondary effects. And so, for example, I'll use a Boone example because here we are in Boone, but you can imagine a family coming to Boone to go to the bike park or walking trails. As they come into Boone, they're bringing their money with them. And while they stay here, let's imagine they stay for the weekend, they're spending money on on lodging, entertainment, food. Perhaps they go to the movies, pick up groceries. These are all the direct effects associated with the trip, associated with the resource that we're interested in. Those direct effects, that initial injection of money, then kickstarts this spending chain through the economy. One part of that spending chain are called indirect effects. And these are effects that stem from the business to business purchases as part of the supply chain that's within the region of interest. So, for example, if part of the direct effects is that the family traveling to Boone to go to the bike park stops by the Boone Saloon and buys dinner for the family, say they spend $200 on dinner, again, that's a direct effect. But then in turn, that provides an injection of spending and output for the Boone Saloon. They then turn around and spend some portion of that on, let's say, burgers from a local supplier. So the spending chain continues, and technically that's a business to business purchase, so it's an indirect effect. To continue the story further, the initial spending into the Boone Saloon, as we said, generates output, but therefore also income for the owners and the workers of the Boone Saloon. If, for example, an employee takes their share in that increase in income and on the way home picks up food for the family from a local supplier, that's an induced effect. So induced effects are effects within the region of interest that stem from household spending of the increase in income that's associated with the direct effect. So in total, because of the presence of your resource, we have this initial injection of money, the direct effect, which then creates these two other spending flows, the indirect effect and the induced effect. Combined, the direct plus the indirect plus the induced effect gives us the total economic effect in terms of increase in sales associated with the resource or the event. And so when you look at these levels of spending, you can realize that in total, the total economic effects are greater than the initial direct effect. And so we call that the multiplier process. And so we have the initial direct effect, but then the total effect is some multiple of that. And this multiplier is what I refer to as the workhorse of economic impact studies. Again, it's understanding this numerical relationship between the original injection of funds into the system and the ultimate total economic activity that results from that initial injection of funds as the money is spent and respent through various sectors of the economy. Accounting for any leakages from the system. So, for example, if someone locally spends money on an import, something that was produced outside of our region of interest, then that wouldn't count. So that's a leakage from the system, and that spending flow leaves our system and is no longer counted. There are two types of multipliers that are typically used, a type 1 multiplier and a type 2 multiplier. The type 2 multipliers are more common. If you just look at the way they're calculated, they're very similar, apart from a type 2 multiplier includes these induced effects. And so the type 2 multiplier would be larger because it's including an extra spending flow, the induced effects. Sometimes, to be more conservative, some studies use just the type 1 multiplier. But again, more commonly, it's the type 2 multiplier that are used. This is just a quick scatter plot from an input-output model, which shows you the level of detail that can go into some of the models. These are all different individual sectors of a local economy. And these multipliers, as you can see, typically range between 1 and 2, are the type 1 and type 2. The SAM multiplier is the type 2 multiplier for each of these different sectors of the economy. As part of the economic impact modeling, the region of interest is also going to be important. as part of this program, that's relatively straightforward. The impacts will be measured at the county level, but for some studies, you may want to think about expanding the region of interest if you believe that your entity or your resource or event has a greater reach. So here's an example of one from a study we did that's capturing a 5-county region. The bigger the region of interest, the larger will be the multipliers, and therefore the greater will be the overall economic effects. But again, for this program, we'll be looking at impacts at the county level. And so there's different ways that you can look at conducting the impact study. Once you have the spending data, those direct effects, captured typically for tourist-based studies through user participation surveys, which is something that will be discussed later as part of this program, you can estimate total economic impacts using these RIMS2 multipliers, which can be purchased through the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's a fairly simplistic way of doing it, and the output's given in terms of total sales. Using the same data, using the direct effects, you could also construct a more geographically specific input-output model. Typically, the one that most people use is called InPlan, and that generates the economic impacts, but given in terms of different metrics. Typically, what we use would be the level of employment associated with the event or the resource, labor income, economic output, which again is really just a measure of total sales, and local or state level or local taxes. So here's an example of one that we did within the center. Most of our impact studies that we do are client confidential. So here's one that we can talk about because it's one we did for the university. Specifically, it's one we did for the athletics department. So the economic impact of athletics here at Appalachian State University. And so what's important here is that we can accurately capture the direct effects. And so we looked at, as part of this study, the wages of salary and salaries of staff. So income for the athletics department staff, a portion of which they will then spend locally. So that's a direct effect. Any spending from visiting teams or families visiting student athletes or visitors that are coming for the sporting events, we need to capture the spending associated with that as part of these direct effects. Obviously, Appalachian State football is a big deal here, so the thousands of people that are coming in on a Saturday, perhaps staying and spending their money while they're here, they're coming for the football, so that's their primary purpose. So we need to capture all the spending associated with their visit. So we need to compile all these direct effects. We need to construct a regionally specific input-output model and then run these direct effects through the model. The model then calculates all the multiplier effects, and then we get our results. And so in this particular example, the economic impact of the athletics department here at Appalachian State is in the region of $54 million annual economic activity. Again, that's essentially total sales. So that's the sum again of those direct, indirect, and second and induced effects. That creates about 640 jobs locally and over $3.5 million in local tax revenues. And so there's an example of the output that you would get from an economic impact study. Again, more details of how to construct a study and a discussion of the methodologies are provided in that chapter. So if you have more interest, then take a look at that chapter, and hopefully that provides a more detailed discussion on the issues talked about here in the video. Okay, thank you for your time.